Which college football teams are recruiting the best? Hi, my name is Brian Smith, and today we're going to break down the top college football programs and their recruiting efforts, the different types of recruiting, why rankings work the way they do, and what you should look at above all else when it comes to recruiting. So let's get started with this. Number one, before I break down the Georgias and the Ohio States and the LSUs, the Notre Dames, the Michigans, all that, it's important to note that everybody has their own system for ranking different recruits. On3, 24/7, Rivals, ESPN, independent, newspapers, whatever it may be, myself, we all have our own dialogue on how we get it done, why a player is ranked higher than somebody, etc. It's subjective. That never changes. But it also makes it fascinating and creates debate, which is good. Number two, location matters. If you have a football recruit that's truly dominant, but he's in an area and or a state that is not known for its high school football acumen, it's a little harder to grade that young man's film. It's probably more difficult for scouts to get to see him live, and that's a huge point. I'll come to that next. And finally, how consistent will he be once he reaches the college level and he goes against guys similar size, etc., because we haven't seen it. Those are players that are very difficult. Again, it's subjective on how you rank those kids, but you'll see more fluctuation as a rule with top prospects from states like a Massachusetts or a Minnesota or a state like Wyoming, Arizona used to be, but now they've climbed right next to them in New Mexico. There's like 2 or 3 kids a year that are really good, but you can't grade them the same. So that's a debate that everybody has to take into account. Finally, a big part of this is trying to get a balanced class. In addition, obviously, everybody wants impact players. That's self-explanatory. You want to have a balanced class. Did you get a recruiting class that didn't have any receivers or didn't have enough defensive ends? Was your priority defensive tackle and you needed 3 and you got 1? So you have to look at it like this. It's not just what you signed in the class. Is it helping you win football games down the road? And I'm not going to get into the specifics here, but certain networks in their recruiting efforts do a better job of looking at that holistically instead of, okay, a recruit is ranked this, here's the point system, and there we go. Those are the ones that are a little more difficult for me to understand, but I digress. So with that, I'm going to talk about the top of the heap right now in the 2025 recruiting class, which schools are doing the best, a few of their best players, some of the things they need, a few teams that need kind of an inside straight to join that group, and then finally, how a few teams still compete at a high level, but don't quite sign as many elite recruits. Why is that? We're going to go over all these things right now. First up, and I'm using a combination of like looking at On3, considering my own rankings, and I'll win out some of that coming up here shortly on the channel. But looking at all the different things, there are a lot of programs that do a good job of recruiting, but there are a handful that it's different. Again, did you meet your needs? Are you getting players at critical positions, etc.? These are important things. And by the way, just to know, quarterback, offensive tackle, and elite receiver, not necessarily quantity, but a dude, defensive end, defensive tackle, and corner, those guys have a different value because they impact the final score more. Keep that in mind as well. So let's start with that. Ohio State right now may have the best class in the country. One could certainly make an argument for it. Why? Tavion St. Clair, elite quarterback, mobile, good arm, good size, could play early at a lot of programs. He's going to Ohio State. He's an in-state kid. For the Bucs, I don't know if he'll play early because they got a lot of good quarterbacks. But here's the thing that's interesting about him. I think he might wait. This might be the perfect recruit. In-state player, wanted to go to Ohio State, committed early, kind of fits what they want to do anyway. This can be your bell cow as a quarterback down the road. I think that carries a lot of value for the entire Ohio State program. 2, if you look at the class, they arguably have the 2 best corners in the country in the class. I'm not going to go into specifics. I know one of the kids a little bit better than the other. I've seen both play live, and they're great. Naeem Offord's the kid I know better. He's from Birmingham, Alabama. If you sign these 2 kids, it would be hard for them not to end up with an elite passing defense somewhere down the road when they're ready to play. It could be even as freshmen. They will push the pile. 3, defensive line. They needed to hit the home run this year. They've got a great D-line class across the board. Hats off to Larry Johnson, that entire staff. They don't have everything cured yet. They need the other thing they really needed offensive line. They didn't get that yet. You got 2 guys committed, one in-state player that's really good. Carter Lowe, like he's a dude. But the other kid, Jake Cook, he's from just outside of Columbus. I'm guessing he grew up a Bucs fan. Don't know him, but that's okay that he's not going to play early. But they needed at least 4 linemen in this class, and they've missed on a bunch of guys. It's going to be kind of interesting to see if they don't get David Sanders, and I don't think they will get David Sanders. Who are they going to get to make up on this? Because going to the portal is not a good thing. So their class is still a little vulnerable too. The last piece, and I don't put as much stock into this as some Buckeye fans, you're not going to sign one of the top 3 receivers in the country every year. They got Porter right now, Quincy Porter out of Bergen Catholic in New Jersey. A couple other kids, one's an in-state quarterback they're going to convert to receiver. They've got a good receiver class, but you're not going to get elite players every year. You just got Jeremiah Smith. Cool your jets for those that are complaining. The other team I want to talk about towards the top, and I think these are the 2 best classes, take your pick. Which one is better right now is Alabama, but they've gone through this a lot differently than they normally do. Historically, Bama recruits in-state, and I think that creates a lot of chemistry, like I mentioned with St. Clair at Ohio State, but they've done everything out of state for the most part. There's a couple exceptions, but this is even by Saban's standard, he recruited out of state a lot too. This is more so. But remember, Kalen DeBoer and his staff are coming from the University of Washington. They had a lot of guys on staff that had West Coast ties, recruiting Utah, Arizona, Oregon, California, and, of course, the state of Washington. They're not going to just completely give that up. And they got 2 corners from California that are elite. McDonald and Lee are both great football players. Is that normal with all the corners down south? No. But they got kids they knew. They got Keelan Russell. He won the Elite 11 by the Elite 11 people. There are varying opinions on who really won it. But he's a really good quarterback. He plays at Duncanville. If you're not going to get an in-state quarterback, get a kid from Duncanville. That's one of the best programs in the country out of Texas. I love that kid's ability. He seems like a leader. He's put in the work. He's gotten so much better since his sophomore year. This is an upside kid that, quite honestly, fits what Kalen DeBoer has done at the receiver position for a long time and the quarterback position, putting those guys together, because the receiver they got coming, Caleb Cunningham from Mississippi, it's not that far away from the University of Alabama where he lives. That could be one of the best combos in the SEC in the nation in a couple of years. We've seen what he's done with Polk and those guys up there at the University of Washington. Now he's just going to try to do it in Alabama. I'm curious to see if the chemistry is going to work. That's my one caveat that bothers me. They haven't done a very good job of in-state recruiting, in my opinion, but they've slayed it out of state. Like they got a kid from Texas, California, and Pennsylvania that are elite players on the offensive line that could all play tackle. To hit a home run in those 3 states, UB Alabama is completely out of the box, but they're great players. They have a couple of defensive tackles that are good. They've got a couple of defensive ends that are really good. I think this is a good class. I just don't know if it's going to work long. They need to win this year because they're passing on some kids in state. That's my one thing. Again, I live in Alabama. The high school coaches will remember that. You better win early, and I mean big. It could cause you some problems down the road. LSU, Bryce Underwood, maybe the best player in the country, depending on which service you look at. The quarterback out of the Detroit area is ranked number 1. Number 3 is DJ Pickett by On3, just so that by that service they would have 1 and 3. They got Pickett a few days ago. He's out of the Tampa area. I know him well. Great football player. They're off to a hot start with the top-end kids. They're getting impact guys. That's not in question. They were the number 1 class early on. They needed D-tackle. That is one of their biggest, if not their biggest need. They just got a big-time commitment out of Zion Williams, out of the state of Texas, big-bodied kid. And they also had Brandon Brown, a more traditional get-up-the-field, 4-3, one-gap scheme defensive tackle out of O'Galley High School in Melbourne, Florida. Very athletic young man. That's a great start. They need to do something at corner, though, in addition to Pickett. They need a couple more. And they just lost out on a kid right down the road who was committed to him at one point, Jabari Antoine. Good football player. He committed to Miami after his decommitment from LSU. I'm sure they're still going to work on him. It's, he's a kid from an hour away. You can't lose kids like that out of your backyard when your secondary was a complete sieve last year. If they play better this fall, they'll have a chance. But seeing their spring game gives me pause about whether or not they're going to be that good there. Receiver, etc. I think they're going to be fine. But O-line, they got some really good interior guys. It's a good balanced class. Just need to finalize at corner. Maybe take another defensive lineman, but this is a really good class with some high-end players. I think LSU will be fine long term. Just need to get the situation rectified on defense, because offensively, this is going to be a lights out program. The other team won't surprise anybody that's towards the top is Georgia. They are still in it for a couple of guys that I'll mention multiple times throughout the rest of the podcast that could catapult them to number one. But these are later decisions. We'll get into that in a minute. But right now, they're in a great spot. They've got their quarterback. They've got a few guys up front. And they've got balance throughout their class. They're picking and choosing where they go. They're recruiting some kids from the Northeast, etc., but primarily Southern kids. And Georgia's just involved, it seems like, with all the elite big guys. They recruit size more than any other program in the country, and they do it well. Their strength and conditioning program, they'd rather have guys big, trim them down, and get them to the way they want them that way. It's a little different process, but Isaiah Gibson, arguably the best strong side defensive end recruit in the country, is in their class. He's a kid from Warner Robins in Georgia. It's a really good player. They got Elias Williams, arguably the best tight end in the country. He's down from just a little bit south of Savannah, plays at Camden County. That is a great football player. He's at least 6'6", really athletic. He will be a matchup problem. They've also got guys that are big up front. Here's something that is a problem. Not many people have talked about him, and if you haven't paid attention, UGA runs a 3-4, traditional 3-4. You need a pure, massive nose guard to run this scheme. I saw this kid at the Under Armour camp in Nashville, Tennessee. Steven Shivers is a behemoth. He's 370-ish, 360, somewhere in that range. But I watched him in pass rush drills, and he was effective. Nobody could handle him when he just did one-arm stab. Any moves that he learns or anything, that kid could be an NFL player. Great young man, but he's just built like somebody that doesn't even look human because he's so naturally wide, and it's well distributed. If he ends up being your fourth or fifth defensive lineman, because they've got Garrett from Prince Avenue at D-tackle, and they've already got Isaiah Gibson, who are probably just better pure players, at least by the rankings and whatnot. And I've seen Isaiah. He's really good. And here's the two guys that I mentioned a moment ago. Arguably the two best defensive linemen in the country are also from the state of Georgia. That state is ridiculous. Justice Terry and Elijah Griffin, and they are the heavy favorites to get both. They could end up having the best D-line class in the country again. If that is the case, there's a strong chance, again, position of need, that Georgia ends up with the number one class in the country. It's at least going to be in the contention for it. They're in on Osmond Croma and several other guys. He's running back from the state of Georgia at Lee County. They're doing a great job, but they got to finalize on some guys that are probably going to make decisions later. I'll probably see Justice in a few weeks at a practice. I don't live that far from him, but I'm really curious to see where things are going, because Justice and some of these other guys, if you put them all together, I don't care what offensive line you sign to go against them. That's going to be hard. D-line matters. When your DBs don't have to cover as long, your linebackers can be a little bit out of position because the quarterback's on his rear end. It's an elite class. The only other one, this is the one in the gray area, that has a chance to finish, in my opinion, in the top five, and they're number 5 right now, and maybe even move up, is Oregon. They've got a few 5-star kids. They're not going to stop. Dan Lanning, coached under Saban and Smart. He's going to continue to recruit in the Southeast and all over the place. They're a very unique recruiting program, doing well in Texas. I'm curious, does Oregon get over the top and get one more kid? Like they thought they were going to get DJ Pickett. If they would have, they might be ahead of Georgia right now in the rankings. And honestly, I wouldn't have had a problem. Like Pickett is the rarest of rare. He's 6'4" corner. Repeat, 6'4" corner. He's committed to LSU now, but that's an important thing to think about. Oregon's class, though, is very good. They've recruited D-line incredibly well the last few years. A little more selective. They still done well there, though. And they've gotten kids from across the country, Maryland, Texas, all over the place. They got arguably the best receiver, DeCorian Moore, in their class out of Duncanville, the kid that Keelan Russell plays with that's going to Bama. Tremendous football player. They're getting impact guys. I don't think they really have a position per se that you're like, okay, well, they're struggling with this spot, though, and they're not filling it up. They don't have a spot like that. They're doing pretty good with the portal, so they don't have as many needs. They just need to take great players, and who works out the best by earning a spot on practice day to day? That's great. And the kids that don't want to wait their turn, they'll transfer out and they'll start over. I think Lanning has them in a very good balanced position. So I'm curious to see how they kind of finalize this class. But if they could flip Pickett or get anybody else that's a top 50 to 80 player in the country, they might end up with a top 5 class, and they could even go in to number 3 or something like that. I don't think they can get into the top 2 necessarily, but it's not out of the question either. So here's the second part of the show, and I want to introduce this in a different way. When I was looking at On3's rankings, just to use a barometer, you have a scenario where the first 5 schools, again, Ohio State, Bama, LSU, Georgia, Oregon, they had the majority of the 5 stars that are committed with those 5 schools. So they obviously get more points, et cetera. Makes sense. For the next 10, there were only like 5. The first 5, there were like 15. Elite players, just as a rankings point of emphasis, really changed rankings. Get a pick. If Pickett had selected Oregon, not LSU, they might be different in the order. Right? Oregon might be 3, LSU might be 5, something like that. It matters. To that point, there is a different way to get to the winner's circle. It isn't just signing 5 stars, although there's never anything wrong with getting the DeCorian Moores, DJ Pickett's of the world, Justice Terry. Always want those guys. Can you win if you really don't get those guys, if your NIL's not there, if you don't want to screw up your locker room? It's one of the reasons Saban stepped aside. He hated NIL and all that because he doesn't have as much control of his locker room and how everything worked. Can you do it? And the answer is yes. 2 points. Let's use BYU historically, and then let's look at their rival. And there's some other schools we can go with too. Clemson really doesn't use NIL very much. Notre Dame started to, Penn State a little bit, a few other schools, but like looking at the list, for the most part, Florida State does to a certain degree, what have you. Can you get to the point where you can beat teams like Georgia on a consistent basis, not just like one game where your quarterback's just red hot? That happens. Can you compete with these teams if you don't? And the answer is yes, and it's twofold. One, because the NIL era and the transfer portal, you're always going to have kids leave. Look at it this way. Kirby, as good as Georgia is, and he's a good recruiter and his staff, he loses kids before they sign. Elite players. It's part of the process. Everybody loses recruits. Once they get to campus, you got to recruit your own kids. That sounds goofy, but you don't even know who they're talking to because there's so much cheating going on roster to roster. It's insane. But you're going to lose some kids once in a while. It's going to happen. But if you have control of NIL and you're not like completely outspending for one kid in the recruiting ranks compared to another, you won't screw up your roster. These are internal things we don't always get to talk about as recruiting analysts, but it matters a lot. I know Kirby. I know that James Franklin, Marcus Freeman, many different coaches are different with that. Now, I've heard, I don't have any confirmation, but like DeBoer in Alabama have really went up when it comes to the recruiting efforts with NIL. Auburn, their rival, is certainly spending a lot of money. Ole Miss has spent a bunch, not just in recruiting, but in the portal. It's a variety pack. Okay. Can you make that work, though, if you're a team that doesn't get the Alabama, Georgia, LSU kids? BYU has always done it. It's just, I know they're not winning titles per se, but they've always been competitive. And they've had years where they were really good by doing this. In 1990, they beat Miami. They won the title in 84, et cetera. They have guys that go on 2-year missions. Sometimes they would redshirt them even after that. So in their 4th year removed from high school, they're playing their first year of college football. They just have older, bigger, stronger, faster kids. Right down the road, the more current model that's worked. Now, this is a great coaching staff, but Utah has done a tremendous job with it. Iowa, Ferentz, like he's done a great, especially defensively and offensive line and tight end development. This is how we do it. You take these steps, you take time, and you have patience with us as coaches. We will get there. How many freshmen do you see playing at Iowa, Utah, BYU, Oklahoma State? That's another great example. Not many. Oklahoma State has a tremendous chance to make the college football playoff this year. I think Utah and Oklahoma State personally are the best teams in the Big 12 this year, and experience is part of it. Utah's got a 7th-year quarterback. Same deal at Oklahoma State. That stuff matters. So you can still compete with the Georgias of the world, especially, again, this is a one-game scenario. It's not the NBA playoffs where you're going to the finals and you're going against like one of the top 3 players in the world. You got to play them 6, 7 times. That's rough. It's a one-game scenario in football. Makes it intriguing, but it also makes one-offs very possible. Look at Michigan getting stomped by TCU in the early portion of that game a couple of years ago. And, of course, there's all the sign-stealing stuff. TCU set them up and burned them on that. Good on TCU, by the way, to catch Michigan flat-footed. But you can do it because Michigan had way more talent than TCU. That's not a debate. You just have to find ways around it. Give yourself a chance. That's the bottom line. Every team has something different. Here's an example. Notre Dame's defensive line class. That's an emphasis for them this year. They got a couple really big-bodied kids and a couple guys that are on the edge that could end up inside, similar last year as well. They're giving themselves chances. They'll probably redshirt a few of these kids and kind of go through the process. That's no different than what Utah does. Not that Georgia or Alabama doesn't redshirt somebody, but a lot of their D-line recruits, critical position, again, they don't need to redshirt necessarily. The only reason they might is because they're loaded a given year, like Georgia usually is. So they might redshirt. Fair enough. But it's not necessarily because they have to. It's just they're not going to play a ton. I'll just play 4 games, sit out the rest, keep my year of eligibility, we'll move forward. Schools like Notre Dame, Iowa, et cetera, that have not gotten the 5-star kids, they don't spend as much on NIL. And by the way, D-line, you want elite kids in the D-line, it's probably going to be an NIL deal. Those kids, they end up being good. Look at Iowa's D-line. Holy moly. Tremendous job of development, so you can do it. It would obviously help Iowa if they learned how to throw the football, but that's another discussion. You still have to be able to recruit guys that at least have the frame, fit your scheme, fit your locker room, don't cause problems with NIL if they get an NIL deal. All this stuff with chemistry, I think those schools do a better job than some of the big box schools that you think of. Ohio State just spent a ton of money on NIL. Is it going to work this season? I don't know. They're trying. It certainly won't be a lack of talent, but you can get there. I'm going to talk more about this subject as we get into this season. Need to see the evidence because like Ole Miss and Ohio State, I think those 2 schools off the top of my head, in addition to Miami, that would be another one. They've spent the most on the transfer portal in addition to recruiting in the last year. We'll see how that works. You got to have a fit with it. Last point to that, the best program in the country of mixing recruiting with NIL is Florida State. They do a tremendous job with development. I think that's kind of the barometer of what Ole Miss was using. They went and got a few elite kids, but they didn't worry about it quite as much as Norvell would. We'll see if that works out. Walter Nolan and some other guys, they had to spend a lot. Florida State got some good players too, but they take a lot of kids with multiple years left in the portal, and they end up really helping them. So anyway, just want to wrap up with that. Just some thoughts about recruiting. It's fun to look at the rankings, who's recruiting the best. But again, it's not just who's ranked the highest. Can you keep your kids there? Is NIL causing you problems? That's something that, trust me, this is a lot of private conversations. There are issues at certain schools with NIL, kids getting mad, kids leaving, deals trying to be struck after they'd signed something and they get there and they put coaches in a tough spot. See these guys awkwardly leaving in the middle of semesters. There's a reason for that. Be careful for what one wishes. You might just get it. So with that, this is Brian Smith signing off. You all have a great day.